Hello, hello, Scoop and Rerum and all that long fancy name. I hope you do well. Sorry about that. Could I heck as like get back onto this? Oh, yeah. Tell me about it. You quite right, Dave. Yeah, I have no idea what I'm doing. I had all good intention. I had it all set up, absolutely beautiful, and everything was going wonderful, and then fate farts in my face every time I get everything organised. I might as well just not bother organising. I might as well just basically just do it off the cuff. At least I don't make a pig's ear of it as normal. What an idiot I am sometimes. Anyway, hello Jack. Hello Stephen. Stephen here, yeah. Jack Mitchell, hope you're well. Sorry about that. What an absolute bell tap I am sometimes. Oh. But anyway, hope you're well. Hopefully, I had everything all sorted, everything going wonderful, and then I make a pig's ear of it. But anyway, this is, we'll get into it, because we're already wasting daylight hour. Somebody asked, will you be covering the, good evening, Reagan, late, hope you're well. Hope everybody's well. Sorry for the pig's ear of it I made earlier on. Hello, Master Templar. Hope everybody's well. Anyway, I'm going to get into this. Somebody's sent a message in the comments saying, hope you're going to cover the Simon Case committee. And it sort of like gave me a bit of an idea. And I thought to myself, why don't I do a bit of a live stream of it? And, watch it together. It's just like it's not as if I'm going to be doing a right lot with my time. So that's sod it. Let's get into this and let's watch this bit. Well, a bit of this Simon Case not privilege committee, but select committee meeting, and like before I absolutely make a pig's ear of this. So no doubt it'll be quite juicy and interesting, won't it? So let's watch it and get into it.
Joined by the Cabinet Secretary and Head of the Civil Service, Simon Case, and the Director General Propriety and the Constitution Group in the Cabinet Office, Darren Tierney. Good morning to you both, gentlemen. I wonder if you might introduce yourselves for the record, starting with Mr. Case, please.
Good morning, Chair. Thank you. Simon Case, Cabinet Secretary and Head of the Civil Service.
Morning, I'm Darren Tierney. I'm the DG for Propriety and the Constitution in the Cabinet Office.
Thank you. The first question has come from me to Mr. Case. Now, there's been numerous cases of senior officials subsequently taking up politically sensitive roles in the past. Do you regard Sue Gray's move as different from these? And if so, why?
I think, as you said, there have been some examples in the past of civil servants moving into political roles. I think there are two particular features that sort of distinguish Sue's case. The first is seniority, and the second is proximity to government employment. Seniority, because as far as I'm aware, we've not had a case before of a permanent secretary going into a senior political appointment. And the second, the proximity to government service, is where we have seen former senior civil servants going into political roles. In most cases, there's been quite a significant gap between them leaving their civil service job and going into the political role. So I think that seniority and the proximity are the 2 points I think have distinguished this one.
The Akaba report noted that the government had provided no evidence that Ms Gray had breached impartiality rules in her conduct after initial contact with the leader of the opposition's team last autumn. Can you confirm that that is your understanding of the situation?
Yeah, absolutely can. Obviously not responsible for Akoba's words, but can be clear that we found no evidence that whilst employed as a civil servant, actually at any point, but especially that time, Sue's advice was coloured by party political views or such factors. As the committee will know, Sue has had a long and successful career as a civil servant, I think 40 years or so, and has served governments of all colours. And through the process we went through, we discussed with officials and ministers, and nobody produced any evidence that could cast a doubt that Sue's advice was ever coloured by party political views.
Wow. In that, I could be wrong, but aren't you throwing a few people under the bus there? You know, saying she was never biased in one ever once. I think he's thrown quite a few people under the bus there, hasn't he?
And so in light of that, may I ask what your view is of the former Prime Minister's suggestion that her partygate investigation was politically motivated, and quotes, "It is no coincidence that she's gone to work for the Leader of the Opposition"?
Well, obviously I don't speak for the former Prime Minister, but I refer back, we found no evidence that that Sue's report was affected by party political considerations. And actually I'm not sure the timeline as we now understand it from the material in the ACOBA judgment quite works. I think, you know, Sue's report was produced early in 2022. Her first contact, as we understand it from the material she's provided to ACOBA, was in October 22, so seems to be a timeline, a gap as well.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Go to my colleague Tom Randall, please.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Case, the Paymaster General made a statement on the 3rd of July
Yep.
claiming that an internal investigation found there had been a prima facie breach of the Civil Service Code. Could you say more precisely what the actual breach was?
Yep. So the key issue was this question about the declaration or otherwise of the contact that Sue had with Lotto, and I think as is spelled out in the ACOBA material, subsequent contact with members of Lotto's team between October 22 and March 23. And the fact that Sue didn't declare those contacts is obviously open to misinterpretation. You know, was there a conflict of interest, or at least a perceived conflict of interest? I think in a material to ACOBA, Sue confirmed that she didn't accept the role until March 23, but we've not been able to test that ourselves. So out of fairness, the Minister for the Cabinet Office felt prima facie was fair language to use in his statement.
In other words, it sounds like to me, just do anything to try and throw her under the bus, doesn't it sound like to me? Utter nonsense.
That word, okay. What are the consequences for those found to have committed a prima facie breach of the Civil Service Code?
In this case, none. Sue is no longer a civil service employee, so but I suspect so there's no ability to even if we wanted to for that to be a consequence. Sorry, I would say, perhaps in the theoretical instance that perhaps one day Sue wanted to return to an official civil service career, as a full-time civil servant as opposed to a temporary civil servant, which she'd be as a special advisor. That might be taken into account, but it's difficult to judge. As I say, at the moment, we can only, as the Minister said, only a prima facie breach.
And in terms of that investigation, can you tell us who conducted it, what was its remit, and how it was conducted?
Yes, of course, excuse me. So the remit for the investigation was set out by the Minister for the Cabinet Office in the House on the 6th of March. I think it was in answer to an urgent question that had been granted by the Speaker, which made clear that we were going to look into the circumstances leading up to the Sue's resignation. The approach taken was sort of proximate to the informal process that we would have initially followed had Sue still been a civil servant at the time. So the work was carried out by Darren's team in PET, and it reported to a panel made up of Sue's line manager, who was the permanent secretary at the Department for Levelling Up, senior legal advisor, senior HR advisor, and an independent senior permanent secretary. In terms of the work, the team checked electronic records and interviewed serving officials and ministers. Sue was offered the opportunity to make representations as part of that process, but as is her right, she declined to do so, I think principally because she was going through the ACOBA process. And Sue's line manager, the permanent secretary for DLUC, was the decision maker in this case.
I have to say, listen to him, he sounded incredibly shady. The coughing, the looking around, the body language didn't look right when he was saying all that, did it? Did it look right to you? Didn't look anywhere kosher to me. Looked incredibly shady. I think it was, a lot of all that stuff was just baloney. What do you guys think?
So whose conclusion was it that there had been a prima facie breach?
The prima facie language obviously belongs to the minister, the statement that went down in his name. The judgment about the conduct was, I will just check the judgment of the line manager on the advice of the work that PET had done.
There was ministerial input into that?
Well, ministerial input into the written ministerial statement, obviously.
Are you satisfied that the Civil Service Code and the Management Code provide sufficient clarity to officials considering similar offers of employment?
I think the Civil Service Code as a sort of foundation document which sets out the 4 values, is clear on impartiality. I think that, that stands and it has stood the test of time. I think there is an issue around the Civil Service Management Code and the guidance that sort of sits underneath it, because I think it was predominantly written with other things in mind. I don't think anybody anticipated this particular set of circumstances. The Management Code is particularly around where it's talking about people going into political roles. It really anticipates people going into elected roles. It talks about how you would have to stand down before you sought election and that sort of thing. It doesn't really anticipate going to work as a special advisor type role, and a lot of it is around sort of financial conflicts of interest. And obviously, it is impossible to anticipate all of the circumstances that you'd face, but we've recommended to ministers, and ministers agreed that we should look at all of this guidance to in light of this case.
Aaron Smith, you wanted to come in briefly?
Yes, just to say, you said the minister had the ministerial input into the ministerial statement, which was what we would expect. What was your input into the written ministerial statement?
So obviously, first of all, as you know, we don't go into the detail of conversations and advice that we've given
I'll bet you don't either.
ministers, but the base material is obviously drawn from the work that was done by PET that had been through the panel, so that base material was there. But obviously the final wording is a decision for the minister, as it's a statement made in his name.
You were in the room for those discussions. You would have advised the minister about the process that should be followed.
We won't go into the detail of who was in the room for what, but you can certainly legitimately expect that the minister would have had full advice on the rights and wrongs of what should have been in a statement. And then obviously it's a ministerial decision about what goes in the statement in the end.
Right. Were you happy with what the minister said in that ministerial statement?
When I appear in front of this committee, I do so on behalf of the government. So, the government the minister took the decision about what should go into the statement, and therefore, I just point back to what the minister actually said. It's the minister's decision.
We understand there was a contact, so I think you used the word contacts, whether you use the word contact, but the word prima facie, was that your suggestion or was that the minister's suggestion?
Actually, I think it was included on the advice of a lawyer, I think, but obviously it was the minister's decision.
And you said Ms Gray didn't take part in that process. That was because her trade union advised her not to, wasn't it?
I don't know all the details, obviously, of the conversations that Sue would have had with her trade union representative, but we did have correspondence back from her trade union representative making clear that Sue wasn't going to take part in the process.
What was the process?
Well, I think I've just outlined it in the answer to the earlier question.
Lloyd, you wanted to come in as well?
Her union, the FDA, wrote 3 times to ask details of what the process was and the appeal process was. Did they receive responses to those correspondence?
I believe so, just check that's correct.
Yeah, we replied to all of the letters, I think, apart from the last one. But just to underline the point that
Apart from the last one.
This wasn't a formal HR process. We were establishing what happened in relation to the run-up to Sue's resignation. So it was an administrative exercise rather than a formal HR process.
So you didn't...
Sorry for butting in, but yeah, Sarah Pickford, yeah, totally agree. They don't know a right lot, do they? And before I go back, hello to all late stragglers. Sorry about that, my fault. What do you expect from a complete bell tap of a YouTuber? I'll get this live streaming nailed one of these days. Might be the day before I pass away, but you never know. What an idiot I am.
Regard the representation of the trade union as having standing as you would with a HR process?
It wasn't a formal HR process. Obviously, we took into account the representations made by the FDA, but we were clear that we could proceed and reach conclusions.
With other examples of people who have left the civil service, Rosenfeld, Kroski, where those...
One, sorry.
Second name. Could we all speak up for the microphones? We've been quiet.
Sorry
to interrupt. I just didn't recognise the second name.
I think it's
Was it Korski?
Korski.
Right.
Korski, yes. Where there were accusations of very bad behaviour. The response from the department was that you couldn't investigate people who had left. Why is there an exception for a political purpose but not for sexual harassment and bullying?
Oh, that's a good question. Oh, that'll be an interesting reply, won't it? Very good question.
I'm not sure I would recognise the characterisation of...
Were those two individuals investigated after they left the civil service for their alleged bad behaviour?
I'm not aware of... I mean, we should discuss separately if you have... I'm not aware of any allegations against Mr. Rosenfeld in his time as a civil servant. Sorry, but I mean, if there are, we should probably discuss that separately in private if there is something that is picking up.
My understanding is, and I'll send you the media reports, so there are media reports on both those cases.
We will look up. Mr. Korski wasn't a civil servant, he was a special advisor. At no point, I think, was he a civil servant.
In principle, you would investigate any form of civil servant even after they've left the pay of the civil service?
I think it would, I mean, to be honest, it would predominantly depend on, there's obviously a question around the amount of time that's lagged and your ability to actually get material to investigate. I think if you're referring to sort of the material in public about Mr. Korski, I think as the complainant has made known, there was contact with us and we gave advice to the complainant about how best to take forward her complaint. I think it's right, isn't it? She spoke to a member of the Propriety and Ethics team about how best to take forward the complaint.
So if complaints come forward for other civil servants in the future, even after they've left the civil service, they could be investigated, but they won't have the right of their union to attend and defend them.
It entirely depends on the case and the nature of the process that's followed. So, for example, there are instances where former civil servants go through what you would consider to be a formal HR disciplinary process, where it's laid out.
They've left the civil service.
That's used in very rare cases, though, where you've got reason to believe that there is criminality, cases of fraud, and that sort of thing.
And that wasn't this case, of course.
I
No,
think it's important
which
to
is
say
what. Sorry.
Just to say that there wasn't a complaint and there wasn't an investigation of a complaint. What we were doing was trying to establish what happened, what were the circumstances that led up to the resignation of Sue, because it wasn't clear to us or to ministers at the time, so that's what we were looking into.
And then just the last thing, the FDA said that they felt that there was no process of appeal if they disagreed with the outcomes that they could engage with. Is that correct? And do you think that's fair to not be able to give the union or the individual a right of reply or appeal?
So I think it's safe to say that I think we took very seriously the points made by the FDA on Sue's behalf and engaged at some length with the FDA about the process and what can be done. I don't think it is a case at all that we were ignoring the representations made by, quite legitimately, by Sue through her FDA rep. I just don't accept the characterisation. We may not have reached an end to the process that satisfied the union or Sue, but I don't accept a characterisation that we failed to take notice or engage substantively with the points.
So what was the substantive response to the appeal point? There isn't one.
I mean, so actually we could well have included an appeal if we approached this if we wanted, but obviously we never got that far because the FDA made clear on Sue's behalf that because she was focusing on the ACOBA process, didn't want to focus on this administrative process, which the Minister had set out in the House.
Very true.
David Jones, please.
Thanks, Chairman. You've already mentioned, Mr. Case, that Sue Gray was not approached by the Leader of the Opposition's office until October. She didn't declare that approach, I think that's right. What action would you have taken if she had declared that she'd been approached by that office?
Obviously, as always, it's quite difficult to answer hypotheticals, and to be honest, how we would have dealt with it, to be honest, would have been largely determined by precisely what Sue had said. If she had said, I've been offered this job and I've declined it and I have no intention of taking it, that probably would have been, it would have been noted and that would have been the end of the matter. In other instances, as we've had one or two instances of civil servants where they've been approached by political parties and they've immediately declared it to their line manager, that they've had such an approach. And I think in most cases people just say outright no, but where they have considered it, the individual's been given a short time to consider, whether they want to accept the offer. And then, if they plan to accept the offer, you can then take, depending on the precise circumstances of the individual, you can then take action to manage that.
It seems that she didn't actually consider the offer seriously until some time later.
So obviously, all we've got is the material that Sue provided to ACOBA, where I believe, I think if I recall correctly, what it said is when initially offered in October 22, she said, not now, but maybe if I leave the civil service.
Right.
Then there seems to have been then it seems to be contact in the intervening period. And then, as far as I'm aware, Sue didn't actually indicate she was going to take the job until after the news had gone public. So I think probably one of the slightly unusual and probably unique factors in this particular case was that I don't know, but I strongly suspect that the news of this appointment or this offer came out in an unplanned and uncontrolled way by somebody who had the information. Because I think from everything that happened thereafter, I don't think that this was a sort of planned announcement.
Would there have been any damage to her career in the civil service if she had declared the approach?
If she declared it and said, I'm not taking up the job, then no.
Do you expect senior officials to declare any...
Sorry for butting, but what makes you think her career's been damaged by taking the job? What kind of a question and reply is that?
Approach with a job offer, or is it only political appointments such as the Leader of the Opposition?
The advice I give people is, transparency is the best way of dealing with this, as you may know.
Transparency in this government. Oh, that's funny, Simon.
It's set out in the guidance, if you like, a management code. All civil servants are deemed to be in what we call politically sensitive roles, which puts restrictions on them. Certainly be wise for any civil servant in that circumstance, if offered a job, would be to be immediately transparent with your line management and deal with it. In other instances, and to be honest, that's the approach. In the few occasions where it happens, that's the approach that people have taken. They've immediately declared it to their line management. I think more broadly, particularly where you're talking about going into a field where there is a conflict of interest, or at least a perceived conflict of interest, transparency with your line management is the best course to follow.
Are you aware of any other officials having been approached by the leader of the opposition's office?
I think we know of one other official who, I don't know whether it was by the leader of the opposition's office or by the Labour Party. I think we know of one other instance where a senior official was approached, and we know that because that individual declared it immediately.
Didn't George Osborne do the exact same thing when they got into power? As a former civil servant. I could be batting up the wrong tree, but didn't that happen with George Osborne? Put me right if I'm wrong down in comments.
To their line management.
In your opinion, is it possible for an official to consider an offer of politically sensitive employment without committing a prima facie breach?
Again, it's difficult to do the hypotheticals without knowing all the circumstances, but I think I go back to my point, which is the general approach has to be transparency, which is, you could be made an offer. If you declare that you've had that offer and you're considering it to your line manager, and then appropriate mitigation is put in place whilst you're considering, and before you do, then it might be possible. But as I say, I think because in this, the reason that this, what does this all come back to? It comes back to this foundation principle.
That's a good point, pedantic peasant. Yeah, look for competent people, likely they'll have been approached. That's a good point, actually.
Our civil service around political impartiality and the ability to serve the government of the day, no matter what its colour, and be able to maintain the confidence of ministers. So actually, where an individual is in a situation like this, where they have an offer, whether they're planning to take it up, whether they're considering it, or whether they've declined it, being transparent with your line manager is the best protection, because then, any necessary mitigating action can be taken.
So you would expect an official to declare such an approach immediately?
Yeah.
And just to repeat the question, if that official didn't do so, would there be a prima facie breach?
And you'd have to look at all of the circumstances, as the point that Mr. Rossmoyer was making. You actually have to go through a process to establish the facts where you possibly can. It's impossible to prejudge all cases beforehand.
Okay, thank you.
I don't know about you, but I got the feeling that our Brexit loon, David Jones, was looking for anything he could possibly to discredit Sue Gray and, let's be honest, Simon Case. Just didn't really say anything, did he? And yeah, I quite agree, Lefty Boater. He does look like a bit of a Y-Fronts fan, doesn't he? Tighty whities. Wonder if his old ones have still got the string dangling down, like he's always like spaghetti.
John Stevenson, briefly.
Just following on from that, do you think this in any way has undermined confidence within the civil service?
So I think initially there was quite a lot of shock about the news when it came out, and it did lead to actually both civil servants and ministers asking the question, well, what does all this all mean for the impartiality of the civil service? I think in the end it probably, I don't think it has. This is obviously something we have discussed, and ministers have been very clear and happy to state, I think both the Deputy Prime Minister and the Minister for the Cabinet Office in the various statements made in the House on this matter, being very clear that they don't believe it does undermine the impartiality, but obviously it made people ask questions.
Thank you. Karen Smith, please.
Thank you. The section of the Directory of Civil Service Guidance concerning the disclosure between officials and opposition has been used to criticise Ms Gray's conduct, but the most recent version appears to be from April 2000, and it's bits that were referred to by the Minister, and you have said this, talk about discussions between departmental organisation rather than prospective offers of employment. So what is the status of this Directory of Civil Service Guidance?
So it is extant guidance, but as I've said, we're going to look at all of this in light of this case, as I've already said. What's clear in the guidance and the management code, which, spells out a lot of this. These precise circumstances weren't anticipated, so we obviously need to update the guidance in the light of this case.
I mean, the Chancellor said that it was underpinning the Civil Service Code. Do you agree with that?
I think it's guidance about how to apply the code.
So you don't agree with that? So that's fine. So you don't think it's clear? I mean, it's from 2000, so it wasn't
that
helpful.
Doesn't necessarily invalidate it, but obviously, as I've said...
Well, we've tried to get a copy, and it's corrupted on the internet, so it's actually very hard to get hold of it.
Apparently, it's available on some platforms, not on all, but we'll look at the tech issue and make sure you've got it.
But it is remarkable then, isn't it, that such a document was then suddenly found to influence someone as important as the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster to then make a ministerial statement. Why did this crop up?
I'm not sure it was magically found in the way, or mysteriously found in the way that you describe. It's guidance that sit there and has been there for
it's guidance that sits there that nobody can find off the internet because it's only available on certain platforms. That suddenly, 23 years on from when it's done, and you think it's not appropriate, said by the minister that it underpins the code. He elevated it to this status, and he was wrong, wasn't he?
I'm not sure I necessarily recognise your characterisation. It's guidance that was there available.
Sorry for butting in, but he looks incredibly shady. They're looking away, looking down. That to me looks like a dead giveaway. So they're being found out. He's looking for any way out, isn't he?
You've got tech issues about accessing it. We're happy to look at those for you to make sure that your IT is.
Well, that's very kind of you. I mean, you've said it's only available on certain platforms, so I would suggest that it's not. Is it available to you?
I think the most important point, which I've now made several times, is that it is quite clear that this guidance did not anticipate this precise set of circumstances because we'd never faced them before. That's going back to my first answer. We'd never been in a situation before when somebody of such seniority planned to leave government civil service employment almost immediately to go. It wasn't anticipated in our guidance, so we need to update our guidance to do that.
We look forward to it, but the point is that as the head of the civil service, it is your job surely to anticipate most scenarios and to, in the absence of a clear process, which is what I think is what we've established here, to advise ministers about due process that is understood and that is to be transparent, rather than rush to judgments.
I can assure you there was no rushing to judgment, and ministers had extensive advice on due process about how to handle this case. As you
is he me, or is he sounding a bit tetchy now? He's feeling the pressure, isn't it?
know from discussions that I've been able to have with members of this committee informally, wanted to be very clear right from the very start to make people remember that there is a human being at the end of all of these news stories, a human being who, as I said, I think whose circumstances changed really quite suddenly in an unanticipated way because of what I suspect was an unauthorised media briefing. We have been very careful to do what we can to preserve and protect Sue's rights as an individual, and also make sure that she's being properly supported as a human being.
And do you think you were successful in that?
I think we've been more successful in some areas than others.
Thank you.
What kind of a reply is that? But my God, wasn't she brilliant? Oh wow, absolutely duffed him up good and proper. Brilliant. Oh, that's marvellous.
Thank you, John Stevens.
Thank you. The business appointment rules are focused on mitigating financial conflicts of interest as a general rule. But do you think they're clear enough in the potential conflicts of interest in a non-financial way?
I think this comes back to the point. I think this is exactly something that we need to look at. I think our initial view is there probably isn't enough about these sorts of circumstances. It was originally designed, as you say, it's sort of called the business appointment rules. It didn't anticipate employment into non-business environments in quite the same way. So again, it's something that we're going to look at.
Akoba's advice. Well, are you satisfied with the advice that they've given with regards to Sue Gray's move? And what further measures would you like to have seen included? Because I've had a look at them and I'll come to one contradiction, but what's your view at present?
Yeah, well, I mean, the COBA, took submissions from all relevant parties, including government and SU. It's an independent body, drew on its experience and expertise, made its judgment. The Prime Minister was happy to accept their recommendations, and, as it were, on behalf of the government, so we'll get on and implement them.
Just curious, you should not lobby government for 2 years after leaving the civil service. What happens if there's a change of government within the 2-year period? What happens then?
So that is one of the things we observed as well. I think it is just boilerplate language which appears in all ACOBA recommendations. I think we might have
Well, they thought through it properly.
We might have flagged it, I think, as part of the process to ACOBA that this didn't seem to make any sense, but I suspect it's just an admin error on their part. But obviously, I can't speak for them. You need to check that with them.
Okay, interesting. Senior civil servants should avoid any political sensitive jobs on leaving the civil service, should they?
The easy answer to that is just to say, no blanket rules, but I'm not actually sure it would be the right answer. I think actually there are people, through the ages who have been in the civil service and then continued their public service career, in a political role, whether that be standing as an MP or as a peer or, working in a party or in other regards. And actually, I think you can quite legitimately make the case that it's to the overall advantage to government, how government works, to have former civil servants, with their knowledge of government working in political parties in a number of roles.
Totally agree, Sarah, Ricard. Yeah, it doesn't make sense. Also, I get the feeling he's feeling the heat, and I get the feeling he's feeling, I'm not very good at this, am I?
I think the issue for me, though, is how that's done in a way that doesn't undermine the impartiality of the civil service. So one of the things I don't think you would ever want to see is people, for example, like you get in the American system, hopping in and out between the parallel doesn't quite work, but official roles and then working for the party and then coming back in. I think that would start to fundamentally undermine.
Do you think it would be far simpler then if we just said 2 years or 1 year or whatever?
Yeah, I mean,
it's just clear cut. There's no issues.
It's certainly one of the things we're gonna look at is whether there should just be a clear, definitive, air gap that is imposed in contractual terms on senior civil servants. But we're just at the beginnings of dealing with this. We've been dealing with this individual case, and now we need to go on to look at the wider lessons.
Can I just revert back to the point about not just financial issues, but also sensitive information? How, at the end of the day, can you ever enforce that?
The ACOBA process is advisory. The individuals and the everyone's expected to do it. There are things that we've looked at, and I think we'll be making
Good evening, Audrey, my friend. Yeah, don't worry about it. More my fault, because I'm an idiot. And thanks for the love and kind regards to my wife. She'll be very appreciative.
There are various ideas that have been raised in the CSPL, Committee on Standards and Public Life, and Boardman reviews about this. And before recess, ministers will be laying our response, which will include things that we want to do in this area.
That's particularly interesting because we're also waiting for the response to our report. So we will receive that before recess as well.
Yes, we have it all together. It's coming together.
It'll be the same response.
We're just doing the final bits, and ministers need to do a final sort of detailed sign-off, and then it will come.
Thank you. Sorry, Mr. Stevens, have you finished your questions? Thank you. Marvellous. Now, Mr. Case, as Cabinet Secretary, do you have any role in reviewing, vetting or advising the Prime Minister about the contents of resignation honours lists before or after it goes to the House of Lords Appointments Commission? And if so, could you describe that role?
The short answer is no. It's a political process.
So, Mr. Tierney, what role, if any, does the Propriety and Ethics team play when the resignation honours list is received and before it goes to the House of Lords Appointments Commission?
So it's worth separating out the two different elements of a resignation list. The first is peerages. So those nominations go direct to HOLAC. HOLAC conduct the vetting and they advise the Prime Minister directly. So there's no role for us in the vetting process for that. Important to note that they only do vetting on probity. They don't do merits assessment of nominations. When it comes to wider honours, then it's for the Cabinet Office. It's one of my teams that does the vetting for those, but again, not merits assessments. What we do
in terms of peerages, you have no role whatsoever.
We have no role in the vetting. That's conducted by HOLAC, and then they advise the Prime Minister directly.
Anything came across your desk though that you thought was relevant for the vetting conducted by HOLAC, would you pass it on?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. And obviously I would liaise, if there was something significant, I would liaise directly with the nominating Prime Minister.
You would do so?
Yes. Yeah.
So on the basis of, you wouldn't conduct an active inquiry, but if passively something found its way onto your desk that might be of interest or relevance to such a list, you would be obliged to raise it with both HOLAC and the Prime Minister? The nominating Prime Minister, not the current Prime Minister. No. Okay. So, Mr. Case, the recent Dispatches programme on Channel 4 alleges that the Cabinet Office officials approached the Palace in an effort to prevent the nomination of Mr. Lebedev proceeding. Is this true, and if so, on whose authority did it do?
So, as you know, we don't comment on conversations between the government and the Palace generally, or on individual peerage nominations. However, it's sort of doubly true in this case because I think this relates to events that supposedly took place before either I or Mr. Turney was in role. However, three relevant points to this. I think it was last year.
Yeah.
Relevant material on this nomination was put in the Library of the House after a humble address. Secondly, the ISC was briefed on the circumstances around Lebedev's peerage nomination to make sure that there was appropriate scrutiny on, I think, questions that had been raised around security. But I think probably most importantly, Lord Bew, as chair of HOLAC, have been clear that in instances where the Prime Minister doesn't accept HOLAC's advice on a nomination, the chair of HOLAC would notify this committee and your counterpart in the House of Lords, the Constitution Committee.
I think there's only been one such example.
And he's been clear that in this case of Lebedev, he didn't do that. And I think you're right, there has only been one such instance.
Okay. Are there any circumstances when it would be appropriate for officials to approach the Palace directly?
No. The Prime Minister is the Sovereign's principal advisors on all matters, including peerages and honours. Discussions between, as it were, officials in the government and staff at the Palace could only be conducted under it would have to be under the explicit authority of the Prime Minister and the Sovereign.
It seems a rather bizarre thing to invent, though, for it to appear under the Dispatches programme. So
First, I haven't seen the programme, so I don't know.
Well, far be it from me to make recommendations for your viewing, but if you were to, you might find it quite interesting.
I'll so put it on the long list.
Put it on the long list. But no, in all seriousness, though, surely there must have been that programme must have, sparked some interest in your office or in the Cabinet Office more generally.
So actually, I think the allegations that came up were ones that had been previously looked into. I think that's right, isn't it?
What was the outcome of looking into?
I think it is the things that we said. I think the material was put into the library as part of the humble address. The ISC was briefed, and Lord Bew made this point, and specifically made the point that he had not, recommended against a peerage.
Yeah. So in terms of that briefing, which is obviously a private briefing of the committee you mentioned, was there anything said in that wasn't put in that paper in the Library of the House, or indeed what you might be willing to say this morning?
I mean, obviously, the answer to that is no, but I think perhaps if perhaps that might be a matter you took up with the chair of the ISC yourself.
Wow, I don't know about you, but I found that line of questioning absolutely fascinating. his body language, his body language just spoke volumes, didn't it? He looked uncomfortable. He didn't really want to go there. He looked all over the place. Oh, brilliant bit of question.
I could do so, but I just wondered if you wanted to say anything on the record this morning.
No, I'm not going to repeat anything that was briefed to the ISC and under the rubric of ISC briefings.
Well, he wouldn't be able to disclose it to me, could he? Because I'm not a member of that committee.
I'm not entirely sure what restrictions are placed on him. I suspect not, but you can always ask the question of him.
Well, it's pointless me asking him the question.
Well, you can always ask, Chair.
Well, I do, and as I'm trying to right now, but whether I get an answer that's satisfactory or not is a different matter. John McDonnell.
Just on that, maybe, Mr. Case, you could watch the programme and then write to us about your comments on your views on the programme itself. That would be really helpful. Just to Mr. Tierney.
Thank you for the invitation.
I look for
That smile and that, thank you for the invitation. I think that meant, no, I'm not going to watch it.
forward to your response.
Request.
Mr. Tierney, as you're the person responsible for propriety and ethics advice, so do you advise the Prime Minister on the propriety and ethics of his behaviour in relation to things like the honours list?
Sorry, which Prime Minister are you talking about?
Any Prime Minister. And did you in the past?
So in relation to who he
In
nominated
relation
for
to how they behave, on for example, on their engagement in the honours list nominations?
Yes, so by definition, though, by the time they've issued the resignation list, they're no longer the Prime Minister. But I've advised both former Prime Ministers in my time in this office on those issues, yes.
More generally then, as you're responsible for propriety and ethics in government, you will advise the Prime Minister about their behaviour, the propriety and ethics of their behaviour?
Where required, yes.
Have you? In recent past? Are there many examples where you've intervened in that way in the recent past?
There have been some examples. I'm not going to go through what they are.
Why not?
Because I previously said to this committee I'm not going to talk about individual cases
Why not?
or casework.
Why not? Isn't that about accountability? What's the point of you coming here if you can't tell us the examples of where you've intervened?
I think when I first came here 2.5 years ago, we agreed with the chair that I wouldn't get into casework, and I could talk about
Things have
the
moved
overall
on
framework.
since then, though, haven't they? And the confidence in government overall and standards in public life has somewhat been shattered, haven't they? So things have moved on since then. So why can't you say, this is how I do my job, this is how I've intervened with the most senior person in government because I felt I had to?
I'm not going to disclose conversations I had with the Prime Minister, former Prime Minister.
How do we know you're doing your job? How can the members of the public out there, you as head of propriety and ethics, how do they know you're doing your job?
Look at his face. He looks ready to explode. Look at his face. He looks ready. He wants to drag John McDonnell over that tower and absolutely knock him clean out, doesn't he?
After you telling us, but without giving us any detail.
I think, Mr. McDonald, there's particularly on this resignation on this question, there is
Just generally, I'm taking the point
I'm
generally.
saying what I think what you're suggesting is that officials need to start taking responsibility for the acts of elected politicians.
Far from it. That's exactly what I'm not saying.
We have been clear in a number of instances.
Mr. Case, that's exactly what I'm not saying.
Oh, fine. Then
I'm
I
saying
apologise
that
for
you have
misunderstanding.
responsibilities. Mr. Tierney has a responsibility. And this is his job title for propriety and ethics in government. And therefore, all we want to know as a committee, how are you doing your job? Give us examples of how you've been effective in that role, because actually at the moment, out there, a lot of people don't believe a word a politician or civil servant says at the moment because of our recent history. And this is an important period in which we can reassert good governance. And we just need to be open and transparent about
So
that.
why don't I give you one particular example, which has worked where,
Don't try too hard, Simon Case. I think steam were coming out of his ears and where he were looking up for heavens for divine intervention there, wasn't it?
on appointment to this Prime Minister, we advised that he should appoint an independent advisor the post having been gapped for some time, and the Prime Minister, as you know, accepted that advice and has appointed an advisor to make sure that one of the important planks of that system that you're describing was put back after a gap.
Did you advise the previous Prime Ministers
Yes.
to do the same? And the answer to that was obvious. Okay. Sorry, Mr. MacDonald.
Oh, I think we've gone far enough, because we're not going to get the answers, are we?
Just a concluding question for me on this set, if I may. Obviously, the most recent set of resignation orders, and particularly peerages, has excited some public comment, and indeed some current, former, and indeed lingering members of the House of Commons as well. Now, are you aware of any rather forceful communications, it might be described, sent by the lingering member for Mid Bedfordshire to both to senior civil servants? Really, I suppose, threatening, it could be described, to use the platform of the Commons and indeed her own television programme to get to the bottom of why she hadn't been given a peerage.
So, yes, was aware of those communications and have flagged them to both the Chief Whip and the Speaker of the House.
Now, do you think that, have you maybe taken legal advice on whether you think the Honours Brackets Prevention of Abuses Act 1925 could come into play?
Seeking further advice on that question. So, taken initial advice but asked for more.
Thank you. Joe Gideon.
Thank you, Chair. So moving on to the COVID-19 public inquiry, is it appropriate that those who are the subject of a public inquiry should decide what information is disclosed to it?
No.
You can hear the cogs whirring, couldn't you, there?
Obviously, there's a process in place to manage this determination about who makes that judgment. The government, as you know, brought a judicial review against the COVID-19 inquiry to get clarity on this point of law relating to the Inquiries Act 2005, and in particular these compulsory notices. But you will have seen there's the judgment has been handed down, which the government will obviously comply with.
So now that the judgment has been handed down and obviously it's gone in the inquiry's favour, how confident are you that you'll be able to provide all the information that's been requested?
All the material that the inquiry has requested was handed over on Monday.
Right. Thank you. And do you know how much money was spent on the judicial review?
We don't have the final costs, but we will set them out once we've got them.
Right. Ballpark?
I'm afraid I don't know. I don't know even a ballpark, but we'll set them out as soon as we've got them finalised.
Yeah, but they haven't still got Spaffer's phone, have they?
Thank you. David Jones, please.
Thank you, Chairman. The former Prime Minister, Mr. Johnson, is receiving public funding for his legal representation, as we know. But I think it's right to say he's been warned that that funding may be withdrawn if he undermines the government's position in relation to the inquiry. I think that's correct, isn't it?
So I can't actually answer that question, and if you'll allow me to explain why. Because I already am a witness to the COVID-19, where I've already have provided evidence and expect to provide more because of the roles that I held during the COVID-19 response. We put in various sort of firewalls within the department on managing the decision-making around how to handle witnesses. So I am...
cheers for that, Audrey. I didn't know that. Cheers for that. So, say Johnson's lawyers have it. Cheers for that. Thank you very much.
And Mr. Turney isn't either, for reasons that I'll let him explain, involved in those decisions about what support is provided to other witnesses and the conditions. But I am very happy, and I will get the relevant person in the department who is authorised, has made these decisions to write in answer to your question.
Well, in that case, perhaps you could relay the matters that I'm interested in to that individual and ask if he or she will come back to me. Mr. Johnson has released unredacted WhatsApp messages, as you know, to the inquiry, and did so when the government was challenging the inquiry in the courts on that very point. Is that regarded as undermining the government's position in relation to the inquiry? I appreciate you can't answer
we'll
it,
get you
but
an answer
if
to
you
that.
can get an answer
that
to
point.
that, please. And if so, if that is the case, is the public funding being withdrawn? And if not, what would lead to the withdrawal of public funding? I appreciate you can't answer that.
We'll write to you soonest.
If we could get a swift reply to that, I think that would
It's,
be
I
great.
mean, I think because you've seen him before and asked questions, it's actually under Alex Chisholm that the process on that, the decision making on the government's handling, for example, on things like the judicial review, which, you know, the decisions on that was all done through that process of without breaching the firewall. So we will get Mr. Chisholm to write.
Alex could write to us, I think. That
Yeah, I'm sure he'll
Thank you.
do so.
Is there any news of what's happened to his original telephone, though, and the messages on that? Prime Minister's phone that stopped working is in a box somewhere. The former Prime Minister's phone.
The Thames, probably.
I thought that had been the material had been handed over, but I may be wrong. But I am now talking about things which I don't have direct knowledge of.
Mr. Turner, do you know anything about it?
I think they're still working on that with him.
Still working on it.
Yeah.
But obviously he took the decision to take separate
Take it to
himself out.
Take it to the repair.
Dragging the Thames or something like that, I think.
Right. Okay. Now, Mr. Moore, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Good morning. Minister, civil servant relations have been described as an all-time low. What's your impression of them?
Yeah, the last few years has been, the last 5 years or so has seen, I think, an increased number of sort of attacks on civil servants individually and collectively by significant political figures, you know, which has undoubtedly undermined the sort of good functioning of government. I'm very happy to say that under this Prime Minister, things have changed very significantly. I think the Chair asked the Prime Minister about this at the liaison committee last week when he talked from his experience about being supported by incredibly hard-working, intelligent civil servants who've responded all hours, day and night to deliver.
Good night, sir. Good evening, Sir Larry the Cat. Could you do me a favour when you're looking after our Prime Minister? Can you look down the back of any couches? You might find Spafford Johnson's password for his phone. Would be very much appreciative.
And talking about how fortunate, this is that tone of how ministers are talking about civil servants in public has, changed quite significantly. I mean, in private, actually, the vast majority of interactions between civil servants and ministers over recent years, even where it's been bumpy, have actually been very good. You know, there are obviously hundreds, if not thousands, of interactions, and the vast majority of them are very good. I'm very pleased to say that under this Prime Minister, with his ministerial team, with me, and with my senior civil service leadership team, we've been determined to improve things where they've not been going well.
Okay, and current and recent ministers seemed happy to criticise the civil service as a blob working to frustrate the government. How do you respond to those allegations?
Well, first of all, I'd point back to what the Prime Minister said last week, where he said he didn't agree with that characterisation. And obviously, I don't agree with a characterisation which is insulting, dehumanising, totally unacceptable. It would surprise me if current ministers were using this language, not least because if they were, I think it would indicate something akin to self-defeating cowardice. Self-defeating because insulting the people who work for you, who are delivering public services on your behalf, advising you day in, day out, as the Prime Minister said, that's the self-defeating. And cowardice because you know these people can't answer back.
So what conversations have you had with ministers about this, and why do you think the accusations gained such traction, and how are you rebutting some of this?
So we've had I mean, sort of lots of discussions with ministers about this. Actually, I should be very clear, the vast majority of ministers go out of their way, I mean, current and former, to distance themselves from this sort of dehumanising language of the blob. They think it's, that it's, harms the government, it harms the institutions that are important in this country. They think it's wrong and improper. There are instances where, this probably talks to a point to Mr. McDonald, an example where, where we do see these instances of improper language that they've been dealt with very quickly and satisfactorily. There was an instance earlier this year that you might recall where CCHQ mistakenly issued a letter in the Home Secretary's name, which include criticism of the civil service or sort of disparaging language about the civil service in it. Raised that immediately at the highest levels, received a very speedy apology from the chairman of the party who obviously oversees the CCHQ operation. He assured me that they would change their procedures and processes, and the Home Secretary herself issued an all-staff message distancing herself from that language, and in fact took to the evening television studios to talk about how good the support was that she got from the Home Office civil servants. I think it was particularly in relation to dealing with illegal migration.
Great one there, Lee Cruz. But do you think he'll have spelt the name right for his password? Probably not. Knowing Bodge, he'll be 000, won't it? Or 1111, because he'd be that much of a child, isn't he, with his password.
Just going back, why do you think it's gained such traction? So, if it's inappropriate to say that, is it just a throwaway comment, or are there frustrations with the way things are going which have led to that use of language? So just trying to get a steer on what you think.
Yeah, obviously it's difficult for me to answer, because it's language that other people are using, but throughout time, read any ministerial diary going back through the ages and they will talk about frustrations with the machine. That's, but that hasn't resulted, that has very rarely resulted in, senior political figures, whether they're ministers, current or former, sort of taking anonymously or name to the airwaves to do it. Sort of why has it come about? I don't know. There is, I fear there is a general trend in political debate about. You look around at many of the experiences that politicians,
very true, Cardigan's
largely,
very true.
Especially women, and across the world, they describe a world that is much more dehumanised, vindictive, much more personalised. So I suspect, and I'm sad to say, it's probably part of that wider trend.
Thank you. David Jones, do you want to come in briefly?
Yes, just briefly. I fully agree that the use of language such as the blob is dehumanising. But isn't it a shorthand way of ministers and indeed politicians more widely expressing frustration at the apparent reluctance of some officials to deliver what the government wants to be delivered? And isn't that narrative stoked by episodes such as the Sue Gray one, which we discussed earlier on? Doesn't behaviour such as that of Sue Gray serve only to underline the impression that many politicians have got?
There's always been, to your first point, there's always been language that's been around by people to express their frustrations, the establishment, the system. I think they've been around, they've been used and articulated over centuries, actually, to describe frustration. I think this is a bit different. I think the language about the blob is being used, I fear is being used in a very, as I say, a very modern dehumanising way. I think, as I said, there are legitimate frustrations within the system. As a former minister, and I'm sure you had them. But what I'm also very sure that you would have done Mr. Jones, when if you've got those frustrations, you would have raised them privately through the proper channels, permanent secretary, whoever, to say we need to take action. I am not happy with, the work that's being done. I'm not being supported in this way. So there are proper processes for ministers, or indeed politicians, who aren't in government to raise frustrations about service that they're getting from the civil service in the end. But that does not mean that it is okay to take to the airwaves, anonymously or named, to use unacceptable language about people who are working unbelievably hard day in, day out in this country to deliver the public services that people need and to deliver the advice that ministers want.
Well, yes, Mr. Case, and you'll recall that when I started my question, I actually agreed with that position.
Sorry.
But the point I was seeking to make is that doesn't that make the Sue Gray episode all the more regrettable, because it simply feeds the narrative that some politicians may be pursuing?
And undoubtedly in the initial... so some people have used it to fan the flames of that particular narrative. As I said, I think you have to treat it as a case on its own. We have to remember, again, the human being at the centre of that, who I suspect didn't take any of these decisions very lightly herself, having given 40 years of service to the civil service, to political parties of all colours, including very many in Northern Ireland. As I said in answer to Mr. Stevenson, actually, it has been particularly important that we assure ourselves and ministers, in light of the Sue Gray case, that ministers are comfortable and happy that the impartiality of the civil service is being upheld, and they are satisfied it has. But undoubtedly, there are people who have sought to weaponise this case.
Well, with respect, we've already agreed that Ms. Gray should have declared the approach. And doesn't that underline the need to put in place clearer protocols that officials may consult when cases such as this arise?
Yeah, I completely agree. It's the point made to Ms. Smith earlier. I think this case, it's actually important for a number of different reasons that we update our guidance and things like the management code. The first is to help people who, by and large, want to do the right thing and they want to know how do I go about doing it. So it's really important that we give them clear guidance about what happens. But the second is the broader point you're making, which is that we need these clear processes in place so that not only the government of the day, but all parties can retain their confidence in the impartiality of the civil service.
Thank you.
My God, didn't he get rather passionate there? I have to say, I thought the way David Jones' questioning was there, I think he was trying to make it out as these people who are calling him the woke blob or whatever are just frustrated people. And you could tell he took exception to that. Now, I'm not sure whether David Jones was agreeing that it shouldn't be done or whether it should be said, because I got the feeling that he was trying to make excuses for these people when really he shouldn't. What do you guys think?
Yes, Ms. Smith.
If I may, I just think we need to be clear what we have and haven't established. I understand Mr. Jones's point about ministers in this particular case went out unusually to make a statement in the House of Commons on a prima facie case, which we've established there was no real process. That's what's unusual about this case, for the record.
Thank you. Lloyd Russell-Moore.
Thank you very much. And I think, Ms. Case, you were very clear that all her work, as far as you can assess for Ms. Gray, was totally unaffected by any of the discussions that happened much later after her primary piece of work had been conducted. When you mentioned the blob, if ministers or secretaries of state use that term, what should be the consequence for them?
First of all, I'm not actually aware of any instances of serving ministers or whatever, using that language.
There's no serving ministers that have used that in the past.
Not that I'm aware of. Where you sort of see anonymous quotes, whatever. Yeah. But I don't believe I've seen any instances of anybody doing it. But as I say, in that particular instance where there was mistakenly language used in that letter from CCHQ on the Home Secretary's behalf that she hadn't seen. We raised it and very swift action, apology was issued, so it was dealt with very quickly.
You said it was dehumanising and it's inappropriate for ministers to use that. Of course, the current Levelling Up Secretary used the term the blob repeatedly to refer to teachers when he was Education Secretary. Teachers are not civil servants directly, but they are in service of this country and paid by the public. Do you think that that language was appropriate?
It won't surprise you, I suspect it won't surprise you to hear as a public servant that I think all public servants, on the grand theatre of politics, right down to the interactions in your local job centre, public servants should be dealt with respect. Where, there's the point to Mr. Jones, we make mistakes. People can legitimately raise complaints and concerns about the service they're getting, but there are proper ways of doing that.
Public servants will know that the Secretary of State for Levelling Up has referred to sections of them in the past to the blob and has never apologised. Do you think that...
Are you sure he hasn't apologised? I thought more recently he'd expressed regret over maybe it wasn't the best way to communicate with teachers.
If he has, I'm sure that would be welcomed. Is an apology in that case sufficient to move on?
So in my view, if in things like this, apology, yes, so long as there's no repetition.
Perfect. Well,
obviously, in the end, it is not for me to judge ministerial conduct. That's a question for ministers. But my point stands that public servants do an awful lot for this country and they deserve the respect.
As head of civil service, do you feel that you have you've expressed it with some passion actually, I think already today, a responsibility in protecting the civil service and civil servants?
Yes, I do. It's a it's a very difficult part of my job. Because, as you know, because you hear it a lot at this committee and elsewhere, and it frustrates you, that when we speak on behalf of the, for the government. But,
how big of a concern for you is the falling morale in the civil service, and what are you doing to address it?
It's a big concern for me. I mean, we discussed it a lot. The sort of the permanent secretary, the civil service leadership, and actually, it's a real concern for ministers. I have been very struck since the sort of, lots of ministers have asked to see the staff survey results to see what's going on in their departments. And I think there are two things that have come out for me from that staff survey, which I think is, what underpins your question. So the first is that point, which I say again, it's amazing to see still quite how motivated and passionate civil servants are about public service. But the message very clear that they feel underpaid and undervalued. So amongst the Permanent Secretary group, we have agreed...
Underpaid and undervalued. Sounds very familiar, doesn't it, up and down the country?
A clear action plan. The first is on pay, which was the number one issue which has come through on the staff survey, where actually our people are judging us by by actions, not our words. Where we've worked really hard with ministers and indeed the unions to secure the highest pay.
No worries, Audrey. Cheers for stopping by. Have a good evening.
Pay increase for our civil service for 20 years. The second issue in the action plan is around prospects. One of the things that civil servants, often talk about is how can I improve my prospects? So we've got a whole programme in place to help them progress their careers. That's improved skills and training offer, and we're giving them clearer guidance and sort of career development plans about how they can progress. Processes comes through strongly, like all systems. Even though we're a human organisation, sometimes we put systems and processes in place that drive our people mad, especially around HR and recruitment. So we've got an action plan on that. And pride in the civil service, which is about not accepting the external narrative. I mean, in the end, there's relatively little that we can do. We have a few opportunities to speak like this. But we are focusing a lot more on our internal communications so that civil servants actually see and hear day in, day out the great work that's going on across the whole of the civil service, and to encourage them to learn from each other. So, and these sounds like simple things, but we have a civil service weekly newsletter which tries to showcase what's going on across the civil service. At the moment, we're in the middle of what we call our Civil Service Live season, so these are the conferences that we hold all around the country over a 6-week period. We're getting tens of thousands of civil servants together to learn from one and each other, showcase best practice. And then things like the Civil Service Awards that we do each year have, are really important. We encourage people to take part in that. So it is a real concern. We've got this action plan. We're making progress. That staff survey was done actually almost entirely coterminously with the Trust Premiership. We have, as it were,
which was then a dip in morale in the civil service, you would suggest?
We sort of then do sort of 3 monthly surveys, and the good news is in quite a lot of places the morale is improving.
On pay?
Yeah.
So when he talks about this 3-month survey, I think they're about as much use as a pile of poo. Because, I just think that I've been on some of them, and you just write the normal stuff just for the quiet lives, so I'm not sure that they really work. What do you guys think? I could be wrong. If I'm wrong, just let me know. Thick skin.
You said that you're working towards the highest pay settlement.
We have achieved. This is for the delegated grades. Ministers have agreed after we had long discussions with the unions, and it's actually the first time, certainly that I can remember, that the pay award we've got for the delegated grades in the civil service is comparable with other public servants. Usually, in the past, civil servants have been awarded significantly less than teachers and nurses, but this time I'm very pleased to say that we've managed to achieve.
One of the issues that the unions raised with us, and one of the issues that we've heard about directly when we visited particularly some of the hubs, is the pay differentials between departments. Creates situations where you will have colleagues that are working on shared projects with the same job description in different departments. And not only does it create dissatisfaction, but it also creates a system where people are jumping around roles rather than staying in them. What are you doing to try and make sure that people who do the same job in a different department are rewarded similarly?
Completely agree with your characterisation. One of the things that civil servants often raise. So we are going through this process of alignment. To align the grades and pay within departments. It's a long, slow process. We're doing it what we call cluster by cluster to start with, but I hope one day we will actually have one civil service in relation to pay instead of what we've got at the moment, which is lots of different departments.
One civil service and one negotiation.
Not sure I will sign up. I'm not sure ministers will thank me, but I mean, as you know, we don't quite have negotiations in quite the same way as others do, but we do work very closely with, with union representatives to try and get them the outcomes that they think our people and we think our people deserve.
Thank you. Several permanent secretaries have apparently been forced out of office before the end of their 5-year terms. What's the point of a 5-year term if, in effect, it's actually at the pleasure of the Secretary of State?
To be candid about it, I think these 5-year terms have got probably what I might describe as limited utility. What they actually provide is, they were the product, I think they were introduced in 2014 during the coalition government era. What they really provide for us is a review point at 5 years about, whether a permanent secretary continues in that role. But as you say, they don't necessarily provide the protection.
So would you agree with the characterisation that permanent secretaries serve at the pleasure of the Secretary of State that they're under?
So actually that's not...
If Lord Russell Moyle bends any further to that side, he's liable to fall off his seat, isn't he?
Quite true. It's actually the Prime Minister as Minister for the Civil Service is the one who appoints and ultimately can decide on the removal of a permanent secretary.
So ministers would indicate to the Prime Minister that they wish that permanent secretary to be removed. Is that the only part of the process, or is there a more formal part of the process here?
Actually, the process hasn't really changed over many years, and funny enough, I was looking back at evidence that my predecessor gave to this committee back in March 2020 when he described the process, and oddly enough, he was quoting Robin Butler, who'd described the process earlier, which, basically said, if the Secretary of State's got concerns, they'd expect them to raise with the Permanent Secretary to try and resolve those. And he said, my role, if they were a point of tension, is to try and address any concerns and help the two of them work through those together. Of course, if that's not possible, we would have to consider alternative courses of action. And what he was describing was either then redeployment for a Permanent Secretary, moving them into another post, or exit. And actually, even more recently, in evidence to the House of Lords Constitution Committee that's looking at this question, he said in the end, if it's the Prime Minister who decides, the Cabinet Secretary can only advise. We do not have the authority to prevent. So the Prime Minister, it's one of those things that we very much protect. For the Prime Minister has been and has strengthened since those 2014 reform, is the role of the Prime Minister in appointing.
So those permanent secretaries that have left early for their 5-year term up, has that process happened with each one of them? Has there been a process where there's been direct discussions on the work behaviour of the permanent secretary, gone through mediation?
In some,
right,
not
Stephen
all. You'll understand I won't go into the
individual
individual cases, but as you can imagine, that process is one that rightly should take some time, where concerns are raised, as in usual in sort of most workplaces, if your boss has got, issues about your behaviour, the best way of doing it is actually to raise it directly with the person.
The fact that it hasn't happened in all cases, does that then put a chilling effect on senior civil servants' advice and work around ministers, for the fear that if they say or do the wrong thing, they might be out the door?
Actually, you'd think it might, but I don't think it has. I think the job that permanent secretaries do is, lots of jobs are difficult across the public service, but, being the top of the shop and trying to maintain good, effective departmental relations between ministers, whatever, is a really tough job that, permanent secretaries do. And actually, I've not seen any of them be cowed by anything that's happened. They keep giving fearless advice.
And you...
I think there's a lie in there.
Because they care. Yeah. Because they care about what they're doing, and they know that their advice, is about making a difference for people in this country, and in the case of many departments, for lots of people around the world.
And you, I probably agree with what you're saying, but you wouldn't worry that there's a danger in recruiting and developing the senior civil service cadre, where they could go off for better stability.
I will do, Dave.
Of course, pay
no worries.
elsewhere.
Cheers for asking.
Those must be constant dangers that somebody could decide, bugger this for a game of soldiers, I'm not taking this.
If their name's dragged through the mud on the
Absolutely,
way out.
And it's one of the things that I find, it's one of the extraordinary things and, frustrating things that's happened. It's really developed over quite a few years, where not only have we got this language like the blog, but we've actually seen the direct targeting of individual civil servants in a number of different roles, and this goes back over a number of different premierships, who've been targeted, who, as I say, they cannot speak for themselves, and they and I and all of my predecessors and the whole civil service is incredibly grateful for when ministers take to the airwaves to actually knock this stuff down. It really makes a difference when people see ministers standing up for their officials.
Is there enough of
the
them?
targeting of Sue Gray, with some of the political commentary around it, will mean that a senior civil service will be less willing to do an investigation on ministerial behaviours.
I think there are a number of reasons why civil servants might never want to do that again.
Yes. Well, on that note, John MacDonald.
Thanks. Just on pay briefly, because it's been raised with us this week in Members of Parliament, it's the issue of non-consolidated payments. What we've had representations this week on is that where there's a percentage pay increase and then there's a non-consolidated pay increase for those civil servants who are on universal credit, they're losing their universal credit. And therefore there's a need for maybe looking at a disregard.
I'll leave that one with
me.
I'll look at the specific.
We got correspondence.
Okay, fine. I mean, if you are able to show that correspondence,
it
would be useful. I'll look at the specifics.
I think PCS will be writing direct to you, but we'll just have a briefing.
They're very welcome.
And it seems to run counter to exactly what the government wants to do in the non-consolidated.
I can certainly tell you, having got this agreement, it is not our intention
you don't
that
want to
anybody
undermine it in that way. Yeah, exactly. Okay. Last couple of questions, really. So we leave you with a song in your hearts before you go away. They're about the counter disinformation unit and the rapid response unit, and this has caused a kerfuffle amongst a number of our colleagues. Obviously, can you just briefly outline the parts of government with a remit to counter disinformation and what that remit is?
Yeah. Okay, so the only one that exists in departments is the counter disinformation unit, which is now in DCIT. It was originally established under DCMS in 2019. It was publicly announced at the time. Their role is to help the government understand online disinformation and attempts to artificially manipulate online information. What that actually means is monitoring trends in
yes, I've been watching the rather repulsive guy behind him as well.
One of two things happens. Either the government can issue a rebuttal, or where they believe it meets certain criteria, including that the material contravenes a technology platform's policies that would be flagged to the relevant company. It's for the company to decide not to take action. The unit does not and never has monitored individuals. It's always operated under ministerial direction. An example of the work that they're doing, which I can talk about right now and will not surprise you, and I hope you'll be grateful for, is the unit is unsurprisingly heavily involved in combating the widespread Russian disinformation about their invasion of Ukraine at the moment. Since the invasion, over 95% of referrals made by the unit relate to state-backed disinformation. There's even more information. We have recently published a fact sheet, multiple pages, on the CDU on the 9th of June. On the Rapid Response Unit, it was closed down in August 2022.
And the Counter Disinformation Unit?
That's the CDU was the first. Sorry, the Rapid Response Unit was the one closed down in August 22, forgive me.
Yep. So the Counter Disinformation Unit
is still going under
process.
DCIT, now predominantly focused on Ukraine.
The line of accountability, just give us the reporting line of accountability so people are aware.
Headed by a senior civil servant, goes up through their chain to the Secretary of State in DCIT.
Right, and then beyond?
Well,
the ministerial engagement is where?
In the department.
Yeah.
So goes from the team, they answer to the Secretary of State for Science and Technology.
Then subsequent report to Cabinet or Cabinet Subcommittee?
There isn't a sub. I'm not aware that there's one that specifically deals with this.
Fair enough. So there's ministerial engagement anyway at some stage.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, so the sort of the suggestion. I know it's caused concern. I mean, actually, there have been evidence sessions in front of the DCMS Select Committee about the work of this unit. I'm told that it's been raised in Parliament over 200 times since it was set up.
You can imagine what
I can well
imagine. Are twitchy about this, particularly when there's been evidence, Big Brother Watch in particular, but the individual MPs have put in requests for information, and there's been some evidence about, for example, the unit getting involved in linking up with social platforms with regard to individual MPs. We have David Davis, Caroline Lucas as well.
I can give you, very specifically, the CDU does not monitor political debate. It does not refer content from journalists, politicians, or political parties to the tech platforms. I don't have a lot more than that, but I'm really happy. I'll give you the fact sheet, and then if there are more of these detailed questions about the checks and balances in place, I'm really happy to send those to you.
I think the issue, you can imagine, the issue is how does it draw the line between genuine dis or misinformation and just legitimate political comment or criticisms of government?
So the government, absolutely right on this point. So the government has a clear definition of disinformation. It's the deliberate creation or spreading of false and or manipulated information that is intended to deceive and mislead people, either for a number of causes. Misinformation is the inadvertent spread of false information. In particular, the CDU operates under clear terms of reference. It only acts if it assesses the material poses a demonstrable risk to public health, safety, or national security. So, for example, the COVID case, there were people...
How did...
So if you're taking stuff from the Big Brother Watch, I can tell you the government does not recognise an awful lot of what is in the Big Brother Watch. Right. I'm very happy to get the more detail to you, knocking the points down.
That would be really helpful. See, what we need to know is what sort of measures have been put in place so that you're ensuring freedom of expression by all, privacy laws are protected, and yet at the same time getting that balance right between protecting against completely rightfully disinformation and misinformation. And if you look at a couple of the examples, Caroline Lucas, where she shared a Guardian article about the failures of the government to prepare for the pandemic, David Davis questioning the modelling put forward on the state of pandemic, they've been flagged up because there seems to be evidence that the unit has approached the social media platforms expressing concerns about those.
So certainly my information is that they don't refer stuff from journalists, politicians or political parties. Right. I will look at those specific things and I will follow up on more detail.
Okay, are there any other institutions outsourced, for example?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay, let me just give you an example. Basically, this is 2018, so I'll raise it now because I want to know if it's still going on. The Institute for Statecraft was funded by the Foreign Office, and at that stage in 2018, there were criticisms because it was putting out a barrage of, from what I understand, attacks on the then leader of the Labour Party. And Alan Duncan, the minister then, was pretty angry in an interview that took place because he'd just discovered it. He ordered an investigation. And what Alan said then, I don't know the facts, but if there is any kind of organisation for which we are paying, which is involved in domestic politics in any way, I would totally condemn it. I've already asked for a report to be on my desk by 10 o'clock in the morning to say if there's any such activity. It'd be useful to know what that report said. Does this organisation still have government funding? And is there anyone else out there outsourced to interfere in that way?
I'm happy to follow up on. I mean, if there are more details, could you share them? So
I'll send it was in the Times and the Guardian.
If
and all
the
the
clerks could just fire it all over, we'll just.
And Alan Duncan's comments are there for the record. But it was something like £300,000 was given to the Statecraft initiative, and it was up to these activities. And I think there was cross-party concern. So any information you can provide would be useful.
Happy.
Thank you very much.
Wow. Now that was very interesting, wasn't it? Oh, that was a bit of a banger.
Well, Mr. Turney, Mr. Case, thank you very much indeed for your time this morning. We're grateful for there's a number of things there. We look forward to hearing from you, whether or not indeed you...
I think we'll leave that there. That was very interesting. 2 questions I want to ask you. What did you think of it? And what was your favourite bit? Wow. I thought there were some belters in there. Surprised I didn't watch this earlier. But anyway. Dave J, I think it would ask me, how's my wife getting on? Yeah, she's getting better. She's getting better. She's each day as it comes, I get the feeling that the medication that she's on is sort of like can knock her for six a little bit, but the most important thing is the fact the most important that she goes to sleep now, whereas before she would be up for days not sleeping. Now when she goes to bed, she goes to sleep, so she gets a good sufficient amount of rest, and that helps her through the day. So, but I get the feeling the meds sort of like do knock her out a little bit, but she's a lot more better. That's the main thing, and she's at home. We'll be heading off for a scan tomorrow. That reminds me, must book a taxi for tomorrow because we'll be going. So, anyway, just want to know also, do you want me to do a few more of these live streams with these committee meetings? I'll see if I can pick some others out, and I might even do a bit of a, how can I put it, a bit of a poll, see which one you might fancy watching, and yeah, Dave, yeah, I'm fine. Yeah, I'm fine. There were a bit of a time when my wife was in hospital. I was a bit cream crackered because I was traipsing up to hospital and coming home and looking after the house, and I was just and I was still trying to do some of this as much as I can when I could, but I was still feeling a bit cream crackered. I remember one night I was on Max's Discord one Tuesday night, and my wife, the day after's bin day, when I'd been up to visit my wife, and she said, "Don't forget, put the bins out tonight. Put the bins out." Well, I got home and I didn't have the best of nights kept the night before because dog of ours, bit of a pain in the backside. She is at the best of time, but she was up and down and kept me awake half at night, and having to do things around the house, cook meals, and traipse up to hospital, so try and entertain my wife the best I can, and come home and try and do something. I was absolutely dead on my feet. And I'd actually forgot to put the bins out. And the next morning, about 12 o'clock, it just dawned on me, and I think, oh, you're a bit of a prat sometimes. But yeah, I'm fine now. Everything's fine. Thanks for asking, Dave. Really appreciate it. And also, thanks everybody in the chat. Sending love to my wife if she's watching. She'll be very, very appreciative. So anyway, I'm gonna probably call it quits here now because it's finished. But let me know if you want me to do. Oh, thank you, Frederick. Yeah, I'll do my best. I do try and improve every video I do. I do try and improve it. Don't always work, but that's the trappings you have to live with. But anyway, is that getting roasted over in first class mail? Is that right, Counter Kev? Oh, I might have to have a little look at her. Cheers, Alistair. Okay. Yeah, cheers. Yeah, cheers, Dave. Yeah. Thanks for that. My wife will be very appreciative. But right, anyway. Thanks for stopping by, my friends, and really appreciate it. I would have a little look on the counter. I think I might have got over 150 watching it. I thought, wow, that's not bad for me. Not bad for me for live streams. But anyway, I just want to, cheers, Counter Kev, cheers. Yeah, cheers, Sarah, Ricard. Yeah. Oh, thank you, Scribby. Cheers, thank you. Right, I'm going to go now, so have a fantastic evening, my friends, and cheers for stopping by, and really appreciate it. Made my day, so thank you all, and have a fantastic evening, and take care. I will do a few more when I get a chance. I'll probably do a lot more live streams because I found a bit of a way of getting around it, so I'm prattling on so sorry about that. But anyway, have a fantastic evening, guys, and take care, and thank you.